My name is Csaba Nicolini. I'm a professor of political science and also director of the Austrian Institute of Israel Studies. And again, I look forward to seeing many of you during the course of the academic year. It's a very special privilege to welcome a young scholar, bright young scholar here at our institute, Dr. Steven Wagner. Steven is joining us just down the hill or up the hill, depending on where you are, how you want to look at it. It's always touching between Concordia and McGill. Steven is holding a prestigious SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellowship at McGill University, where he's currently at the Department of History and Classical Studies. Steven received his Doctor of Philosophy, his D.Phil, from the University of Oxford. He received his BA and MAs from the University of Calgary. At present, as I mentioned, he's at McGill, and he is working very hard on turning his D.Phil into a book. Using Hebrew, Arabic, and declassified British intelligence records, the book will analyze the influence of British intelligence on policy in Palestine, and he will be arguing in the book that intelligence shaped policy, and it was fundamental to British and Zionist power structures. The book will also offer an original explanation for the origins of the Arab-Zionist conflict, the nature of Zionism and Arab nationalism in Palestine, in the mandatory Palestine, as well as the respective failures and successes of each national and political movement. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Steven. We agreed that he would speak for about 35 minutes or so following the talk. So I would ask you to please hold your questions so that Steve would have an opportunity to fully flesh out his argument. At the end of his talk, I'm going to then moderate the conversation by collecting your questions. And at that point, I will ask you just to identify yourself so that we would all know each other's names around the table when you ask the question. So Steve, the floor is yours, 35 minutes.
Thank you so much. It's a very kind introduction. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited to share one of the most, well, certainly one of my favorite discoveries during my research. Declassified signals intelligence, or SIGINT, records have changed my mind about key issues relating to British policy in Palestine and the wider Middle East. Now, in particular, I'm talking here about how they've changed my mind about the emergence of the 1939 Palestine White Paper, a crucial moment in that country's history and also the history of world Jewry. The White Paper abandoned Britain's support for Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine, embodied in the Balfour Declaration since 1917, and instead planned for an independent federal state of Palestine. Now, this was a radical departure. British policy with few limits had steadfastly supported Zionism for 22 years, and those years witnessed close cooperation in intelligence between the British and Zionists, especially during the Palestinian revolt, which had raged since 1936. Zionist leaders, such as Chaim Weizmann, were accustomed to being included in the policymaking process since at least First World War, but in 1939 found themselves shut out. In consultation with the Arab states rather than the Zionists, Britain's Palestine policy changed course. And by limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine to about 1,500 per month on the eve of the Second World War and the Shoah, the White Paper became the focus of the Anglo-Zionist conflict after the war. Historians have not fully explained the emergence of the White Paper because, for one, the evidence hasn't been totally available until recently. Historians have given a number of explanations for this watershed. One, and the one that I most subscribe to, is that on the eve of World War, British policymakers sought to adopt a pan-Arab policy and strategy and had to sacrifice their support for Zionism. Two, that this was an extension to the Middle East of Britain's appeasement policy, as the White Paper rewarded the Palestinians with a plan for self-government after 3 years of bloody revolt and intransigence. And finally, that British decision-makers were anti-Semites or at least indifferent to Jewish suffering in Europe. Now, neither 3 or 2 are well substantiated by the evidence. Not to say that there's no anti-Semitism in this story, but simply that this is not what's driving policy change. I argue instead that Britain took this decision not to appease the Palestinians, but to spite them. Whereas appeasement sought, among other things, to buy time for rearmament, the White Paper sought to buy goodwill and influence in the Middle East. I argue that the first statement is closest to the truth, but has missed the mark. British policymakers never expected the Islamic or Arab worlds to love Britain suddenly for limiting Zionism. In crafting the white paper, British diplomacy targeted one statesman in particular, the founding king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Now, historians have been wrong about Anglo-Saudi relations, usually portraying them as hostile. I'll get more into that ahead. But only 3 scholars have examined Saudi influence over the process which led to the White Paper of 1939. These are Eli Kaduri, Rosemary Said Zahlan, and Mikhail Kahanov. Other authors, such as Michael Cohen, have noted that the British paid attention to Saudi interests, but in general, the narrative that we have has not incorporated this element of the story into their argument or narrative. So Rosemary Said Zahlan noted in an article the influence of Ibn Saud's protests against the 1937 Peel Commission's recommendation for partition, noting that the British at least paid attention to his interests when deciding maybe that partition wasn't the best idea for the empire. Kaduri's argument, made in 1980, has been ignored by historians who, like Kaduri, lack the evidence now available. His essay, Great Britain and Palestine, The Turning Point, emphasizes the role of the Foreign Office in Britain's retreat from the partition plan. Now, partition was, of course, first proposed in 1937 as a response to the Arab Revolt. Now, neither essay goes far enough in their explanations. Ibn Saud was an influential Arab leader who, it was believed, would be able to use his reputation to keep the Middle East from erupting against Britain during a future world war. And by reading his communications, Britain was able to craft a new policy which could leverage his influence over the Arab states and nationalist movements. Mikhail Kahanov's book, published a year before his death in 2013, looks at Ibn Saud's role in the Palestine question or conflict. Is based on good scholarly research, although it should be noted that Kahanov was a senior figure in the Mossad and military intelligence. Kahanov is the only scholar to portray Ibn Saud in the same light which I see him, a master statesman and practitioner of realpolitik, simultaneously the vanguard of Wahhabi Islam. Ibn Saud always allowed state interests to dominate. And while it was quick to refer to some of the nastier depictions of Jews from the Quran when frustrated, he consistently demanded that any solution to the Palestinian problem must secure the Jewish community there and their interests as a minority group. His relationship with Britain was key to his policy, and as I argue, so too were Anglo-Saudi relations, key to Britain's Palestine policy. He always sought to preserve a friendship or informal alliance and saw British hegemony as the key to his own security. Now, none of these books have told the whole story because intelligence, the missing dimension here, has not been incorporated into the narrative. That narrative has scarcely been incorporated into the events of the wider Middle East, has incorporated the events of the wider Middle East into the story of the 1939 White Paper. We should probably talk about intelligence before I move on. So Britain's Signals Intelligence Agency was called at this time the Government Code and Cipher School, or GC&CS. This was a precursor to today's GCHQ. These are the ones who listen to your phone calls and that sort of thing. Now, GC&CS had been monitoring the communications of Ibn Saud since about 1930, when his Wahhabi scholars, through negotiation, actually allowed him to use radio, which they looked upon suspiciously. GC&CS, by the way, is the same institution that broke the German Enigma code in World War II, of Alan Turing fame from the Imitation Game film, if you saw it. But we're not talking here about machines decrypting these communications. This is all pencil and paper and much more simple kind of procedures. Now, GC&CS records from its founding in 1919 until the end of World War II in 1945 are available to researchers at the UK National Archives. And my arguments rely on these records, which were declassified between 1999 and 2003. They're scarcely used, even though you could retell all world diplomatic history during these years using records in plain English of French, Japanese, Italian communications, everyone around the world, American. Now obviously I'm focused on GC&CS coverage of the Middle East. I also use material from other declassified intelligence files, as well as material which I found in Israel, written off in shared intelligence with their Zionist counterparts, upon whom they relied deeply during this period. Some of these records were shared, others were stolen, and a small amount was simply left behind during the British exit during 1947-48. I also used Arabic and Hebrew sources in my research, although less so for this paper. So here's an example of a decrypted solution that would arrive to this. You have a serial number, they're all numbered, you have a title, a date, and they're either going to be a verbatim account of the communication, or they're going to be a summary like this one. And this was sent from Sarafan, the big British signals intelligence base, today it's Rifin, still an IDF base, to the War Office and distributed to these offices. Basically, you get a summary if you have to send it by wire because you don't want another state to figure out what code you're using. If you send it by bag, you can send the original text. Now I've posted my definition of intelligence, and it's important to know that there's no single definition for top left. But signals intelligence emerges during the First World War with the advent of radio. The convenience of using radio means that anyone can listen. And until sometime during the Second World War, most states have a very weak appreciation for the security of their codes. Private institutions like banks are the best at keeping their code secret, but GC&CS is working on cracking global communications from the beginning of the First World War until today. Ibn Saud, for his part, used radio and a simple schoolboy cipher, which is a transposition cipher, to govern remotely as he preferred to travel the country rather than sit in one palace throughout the year. So he traveled with the radio set. And like most governments around the world, Ibn Saud did not appreciate the importance of cipher security. So you can easily crack a schoolboy cipher just by playing with the anagrams of the text that you get. My hypothesis is that he used this cipher to keep secrets from his own court rather than imagining that any other government might be listening to his communications. And he's not the only one to make this mistake, and the British themselves often break radio security during the interwar years, and even had twice made known their ability to break other states' codes. So, you can't really understand this story without understanding Ibn Saud. As I said, historians have been wrong about him. Saudi Arabia of the 1930s was not the same country as it is today. It was poor. Oil was only discovered there in 1938. And it was also surrounded by enemies and rivals. Ibn Saud's life story tells us a lot about his policy. He was born in 1875, the son of an important Wahhabi family in Najd, which refers to the Arabian hinterland. His family has, for about 300 years, maintained a codependent alliance with the Wahhabi ulama, or scholars, and that has lasted until today. In his youth, his main political challenge was the hereditary rivalry between his family and the Rashidi, who were patronized by the Ottoman government. And at this time, the Ottomans were trying to centralize administration. The Rashidi conquered Riyadh in 1890. Abdulaziz was 15 years old when he experienced this bitter defeat. He spent his early adulthood in refuge in Kuwait, and by age 26, he began to raise Bedouin forces and lead them on raids into Rashidi territory. And what began as a campaign of loot and revenge transformed into a religious or spiritual campaign. Riyadh was reconquered on his birthday in 1902, now aged 27. Abdulaziz attracted more support from his stronghold. The Rashidis began to look to the Ottomans for more protection, and periodic warfare ensued with initial Saudi defeats, but between 1911 and 13, the Arab world was in tumult, not just in the peninsula, as the Ottomans were losing more territory to Italy, and other Christian powers appeared greedier than ever. Before World War I, Ibn Saud looked like the only source of strength in the Arab world. In 1913, he defeated the Rashidi in the Al-Hassa territory on the Gulf Coast. That's here. And suddenly, Britain needed to pay attention to him, as they maintained a treaty system with the other emirs of the Gulf. And as a result also of his campaign, the Arab literati in the Arab capitals and also in Istanbul started to pay attention to Ibn Saud. He was hailed as the Bismarck of Arabia, destined to unify the Arabic-speaking peoples from his Arabian Prussia. Islamic secret societies in the Ottoman army adopted Ibn Saud's green banner. Now, he was independent, wielded considerable prestige in the Arab world during this time, and since about 1913, they thought of him as the guy who's going to lead the movement and unite all the Arab lands. Britain's relationship with Ibn Saud was turbulent between 1915 and 1933, although he was generally regarded with respect. He was usually trapped in one security dilemma or another with his neighbors. And Britain's aim always was to stabilize borders. Britain militarily contained Ibn Saud during the 1920s, but also sought solutions to security dilemmas, trying to define borders and negotiate treaties. So a pattern emerged in Anglo-Saudi relations where he favored British predominance in the region and in return received recognition, security guarantees, and non-interference. Britain's main aim was to achieve stability. And that's why they signed this series of treaties with him beginning in 1915. And as he expanded, they recognized him at every step. So even though he deposed their allies in Hijaz, the Hashemite family, which is still ruling Jordan today, from the province which holds the two Islamic holy cities, they recognized his status within a few years. Now, the British military contained his forces and his Ikhwan followers, right? His Islamist followers from expanding into neighboring territory. So there were definite limits to this relationship as well. Anglo-Saudi relations improved in 1932 when Hamid ibn Rifada led an anti-Saudi revolt in Hijaz, possibly with clandestine support from the Hashemites, but who knows. Regardless, Rifada was defeated with British help. The Royal Air Force, Arab Legion, Trans-Jordanian Frontier Force, and police closed the border and disarmed rebels trying to come in and out of Hijaz. Britain feared escalation and needed to prove its neutrality to Ibn Saud. Of course, they did recognize him by treaty. Ibn Saud attracted a number of Syrians to his court as well, so there was a firm relationship between the Pan-Arab movement and his administration. People who had been Pan-Arabists, say during the Ottoman period, were now his ministers of war, minister of foreign affairs, that sort of thing. Now, from 1930 or so, when he starts to use radio, the government code and cipher school can start to provide solutions to his communications to the government and give them a clear understanding of his policy and diplomacy. And the British Foreign Office used this to improve their relations with him and engender a sense of reliability and security. And this went two ways. These records show his inclination to always prefer to do business with Britain over any other power. By 1935, the Foreign Office concluded that its control over the region depended on Britain's ability to show sufficient force to contain Ibn Saud. They were firm with him over border disputes, but otherwise the relations were cordial. During the Abyssinian crisis, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, during 1935, British signals intelligence observed his very cool response to Italian overtures for arms deals and for warmer relations. Ibn Saud saw Italy as Britain's enemy, which it was, and he saw that Italy's treatment of Muslims, say in Libya, was far harsher than Britain's was in any other territory. So he trusted Britain to take better care of Muslims, but also to maintain his own status. Suspicious of Britain's enemies, and always willing to discuss their activity with the British minister in Jeddah, he proved himself an increasingly reliable partner. Now, Palestine complicated his relationship with Britain. On the one hand, his relations with Britain had been improving, although they were based on the assumption that British power was good for Muslims. When the Palestinian revolt broke out in 1936, this challenged that assumption, and his positive relations with Arab nationalists, who had seen him as the likely standard bearer for the pan-Arab movement for over 2 decades, this created a tension. This was especially so since 1934, when the Palestinian leader and Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, and other pan-Arab leaders helped to broker peace between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. This moment was hailed in the pan-Arab movement as an opportunity for unity, as 2 out of the 3 independent Arab kings were no longer at war with one another. And with European crises growing more severe, they planned to exploit Germany and Italy's growing belligerence to leverage their independence, especially in Syria and Palestine, from Britain and France. Ibn Saud was a key ingredient to their strategy, but his good relations with Britain were not well understood outside the king's court. And I should add here that the Palestinian strategy for a general strike, which might escalate to a revolt, was reasonable. The Syrians forced France to the negotiating table after a 50-day strike in early 1936. This coincided with the height of the Rhine crisis in Europe, and France could not afford to suppress another revolt. Of course, they had done so earlier. One can only wonder what the result would have been had the Palestinians timed their strike to coincide with that in Syria. Now, since he appeared to share interests with both the British and the Palestinians, Ibn Saud became involved in the Palestine question in 1936 when, in secret collaboration with the British government, he intervened and asked the Palestinian leader, Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, to call off the general strike and revolt. They aimed to appeal to the Mufti's sense of self-importance by being directly appealed to by the independent Arab states, but also to allow him to save face after intervention. The revolt paused for about 10 months, although violence against Jewish targets continued sporadically. Britain had silently hijacked the Pan-Arab program for independence and deprived its Arab enemies of their strategy to use Ibn Saud's influence for their ends. Britain was steadfast in its refusal to concede any promise to the Mufti or the Arab states, other than to address these issues at the Royal Commission. Yet, by involving Ibn Saud and the other Arab kings, Britain conceded that the Palestine problem had now become a pan-Arab one, not peculiar to Palestine, as the police intelligence put it. Indeed, Britain had relinquished some control over its Palestine policy and created new expectations that Arab states had a stake and a say therein. Another consequence was Ibn Saud's improved prestige in the pan-Arab world. Now, the next summer, 1937, the Royal Commission on Palestine infamously recommended partition. For the first time, Britain's official policy became the 2-state solution. Arab nationalists were furious, and the Palestinians returned to revolt within weeks. Ibn Saud asked the British minister in Jeddah whether he could intervene again, and when he was told no, he raised the stakes. He demanded territory in Transjordan for a corridor to Syria, and also threatened to intervene in the Alexandria question, a province in the bottom of Turkey. Then a negotiation between Syria, France, Turkey, and the Arab movements at the League of Nations. Ibn Saud was under pressure to raise jihad against Palestine. SIGINT intercepts revealed that various sheikhs around the peninsula offered their willingness to participate. Ibn Saud cabled the Mufti via intermediaries and asked what his plans were, urging the Palestinians to trust Ibn Saud. The reply defined the minimum demands of the Mufti as related by the Saudi minister in Damascus. This included the abrogation of the mandate, Palestinian independence, and a willingness to make adequate provision guaranteeing the rights of Jews as a minority in the land, and to conclude a treaty on this basis with the British government on the lines of the Iraqi and Syrian treaties. They all say, meaning the rebels, death or life with honor. Britain possessed, due to this intercept, the minimum bargaining position of the Mufti on the eve of the September 1937 Blue Dam Conference, which was the organizational basis for the renewed revolt. This knowledge explains Britain's disinclination to reach compromise. As the Palestinians doubled down, it became clear that partition would have to be implemented by force, if the British were serious about it. Nevertheless, British diplomats were able to calm him down, saying that partition was still open to interpretation, Ibn Saud remained loyal, he never lied to Britain, and GC&CS intercepts proved it. They understood that his reactions were driven by real insecurities, that he was surrounded by rivals who were better armed and who coveted parts of his territory and coveted his prestige as well. British intelligence knew that Ibn Saud feared the enlargement of Transjordan because the Peel proposal sought to annex the Arab parts of Palestine to Abdullah's kingdom there. Ibn Saud was hostile to Britain's enemies, especially Italy, and thought little of the nationalists in Syria and Palestine, and he endeavored to stay out of the revolt raging, although his citizens were once caught trying to smuggle arms. His main interest, intelligence intercept showed, was to pursue closer relations with Britain for the sake of his own security. So even at the height of tensions between the two sides, he's still driving for an improvement of relations. The public still saw him as hostile to imperialism, where in fact he trusted Britain to keep him independent. Things have become more complicated because of the Munich crisis in 1938. While Chamberlain is negotiating with Hitler over the future of Czechoslovakia, 3 out of 5 of Britain's reserve divisions were tied down in the Middle East, 2 of which were in Palestine fighting the rebels. British policy had to change. Signals intelligence guided an improvement in Anglo-Saudi relations and shaped a new policy. This is also interesting because the Secret Intelligence Service at MI6 produced their first ever policy paper during the Munich crisis, and among the recommendations they included using appeasement to buy time. They also said to settle the Palestine question in favor of the Arabs. So this was seen as a key strategic issue. And this was important in the British decision, at least to abandon partition as a solution. Equally important was their consideration for the positions of the Arab states. From the end of September, Britain's diplomatic strategy at the Foreign Office Middle East Committee focused on measures to influence minor powers and the Arab states. So they're talking about bribery and other things that might keep the Arabs on side during a future world war. But very suddenly after the Munich crisis, they went from refusing to talk about limiting the Zionist policy to entertaining. And in November 1938, they planned a conference, a Jewish-Arab conference, to be held at the Palace of St. James in early 1939. Most interestingly to me, the British asked Ibn Saud whether they should invite the Mufti to the conference. And in his words, he said he had no use for the Mufti and would not be troubled by his exclusion. So this shows you who's calling the shots here, actually, and for whom this conference is being held. MacDonald, the colonial secretary, was clear that in the long run, Ibn Saud's friendship would be worth more than the friendship of any of the other Arab princes, in his words. And the Joint Intelligence Committee and chiefs of staff shared these views. And they were mainly worried about territorial offers by Germany or Italy to the Arab countries, should there be a future world war. So the Foreign Office convenes a conference at St. James in early 1939. The Zionists sat down with delegations from the independent and semi-independent Arab states, as well as an informal Palestinian delegation, of course, excluding the Mufti. Meanwhile, the revolt was being crushed by the army in Palestine. The Arab nationalists had, for a decade, planned to exploit a European crisis to achieve independence and pan-Arab unity. Now was their chance, and they blew it. Predictably, the conference failed as the Arab and Zionist delegations could not agree on the most basic terms. What none of them knew was that GC&CS was providing copies of their communications home to the Prime Minister and Colonial and Foreign Secretaries. Normally, GC&CS could turn around a message from the point of interception until there was a translated solution in a policymaker's hands. Usually it's a 2-3 week process. During the conference, 24 hours, just to show you the level of importance for the intelligence community's customers in government. This intelligence revealed the Arab states' bargaining positions. Ibn Saud wanted to end Britain's Zionist policy. He genuinely disliked it, but such a victory would boost his prestige in the Pan-Arab gallery. The Palestinians' minimum bargaining position, known via GC&CS, could not reasonably be met. It, of course, would involve making Mufti president for life of Palestine or something like that. I'm exaggerating, but there's no way they were going to include him again in government. Now, 2 days after the failure of the conference, Anglo-Arab talks continued while the Zionists were shut out. Ibn Saud defined his position to his son and delegate Faisal, also his successor. It is no secret to them, meaning Britain, what effect this failure will have in the Islamic and Arab countries, nor are they unaware of the scorn of their enemies who are exploiting this situation. Propaganda was working in Egypt and Iraq against both Britain and Ibn Saud. The Palestine question would echo throughout the Islamic world. His prime interest was his relationship with Britain. In his words, "This is an essential matter that may cause injury to my country. I therefore want to be quite certain regarding Britain's moral and material support to me and everything that may cause harm to my country from any direction whatever." He also wanted to preserve the status quo of borders. And this position was very familiar. It followed a 20-year pattern which had evolved since the end of the First World War, but it had become certainly pronounced during the 1930s. The next day, Faisal met with members of the cabinet and permanent undersecretaries for 2 hours. And that's when you know it's serious, when the civil service is involved, of course. The British government communicated proposals to Faisal and asked him to secretly meet each delegation to the conference, each Arab delegation. MacDonald and Halifax, the colonial and foreign secretaries, aimed to prop Ibn Saud up as champion of the Arab cause, so they gave Faisal a chance to consult with Egypt and Iraq to offer a counter-proposal. And within a few days, they provided Chamberlain a new proposal. The Prime Minister approved, and the exact text of his reply to Ibn Saud is unavailable. It is believed to be the main substance of what became the White Paper. The Iraqi delegate reported one version of it, that independence would be granted upon the end of the revolt, that there would be a legislative assembly, that the mandate would terminate. Immigration would continue with limits and would end after a 5-year transition. So it's not exactly what worked out, but you can see they're on track as a result of that very first meeting in London. So the Arab delegations convened again in Cairo during April-May 1939, provided draft texts for a new policy, negotiating amongst themselves and informally with the Rorschach Commission. They're trying to persuade at the same time the Palestinian leadership in exile, including the Mufti, to agree to their proposals. Chaim Weizmann, for his part, tried to intervene. He flew to Cairo to offer the Egyptian Prime Minister a significant bribe of £150,000 to postpone the conference for 6 months, and he was rebuffed. Meanwhile, the Arab states could not agree on the details, and despite trying desperately, failed to convince the Mufti and his entourage to accede. British policy reverted to a position which satisfied the Saudis, but not the Palestinians. This is what became the White Paper, the most severe blow to Zionism since 1917. And once Cairo was close to agreeing on the new draft, they tried to get the Palestinians to agree, but they had a few problems. One was a lack of trust after years of revolt. The Palestinians reasonably would never trust Britain's intentions to include them in government, and Britain never signaled any willingness to do so, although they were planning on trying to foster knowledge of government through a civil service during the transition period. So it was clear that these renegades would never be invited back. Another major stumbling block was the Mufti himself and his personality. He was a bit of a megalomaniac. For one thing, there was about a 2-week delay in this process, getting the Palestinians to even consider agreeing, because the Mufti had not been personally invited to Cairo to consult. And he wasn't even going to go, fearing arrest. He would have sent a delegate. But this is one of the things that delayed the process. Now, in the first week of May, the Mufti's cousin and confidant, Jamal, is with Ibn Saud at Bahrain, going over the final text proposal together. Ibn Saud had been stalling with the British, waiting for the Palestinians to get their act together and come up with an answer. The British political agent at Bahrain reported on the festivities that both he and Jamal attended at Ibn Saud's court. Ibn Saud went to great lengths to demonstrate publicly his close and warm feelings towards Britain, keeping the political agent by his side the entire evening, made several rude jokes about Hitler and Mussolini, so rude that he would not repeat them in text, while predicting Mussolini's downfall for interfering in Muslim affairs. Ibn Saud emphasized his intention to assist Britain on the Palestine question, offering a clear signal to Jamal, the subtext here being everyone knew that Jamal and the Mufti had been accepting material support from the Italians throughout the revolt. Within days, the Foreign Office signaled Ibn Saud with a sudden and surprising change of tone and tact, emphasizing the informal nature of Anglo-Arab talks, saying that because there had been no formal reply from the Arab delegations, they were going to impose a solution, and they reverted to the text that the British agreed on with the Saudis in the first place. Now, until the last minute, the Arab delegations achieved adjustments in the final text of the white paper, which supported Palestinian demands, especially the inclusion of a 5-year schedule for the emergence of this federal state of Palestine. Simply absolved himself of the problem, saying that if Palestinians wouldn't agree, he'll take no further responsibility for its future or implementation. White paper was published on the 17th of May, and the future of Palestine was reshaped. 22-year-old Zionist policy was scrapped in consultation with the Arab states and against the wishes of the Zionists, Britain's traditional negotiating partners. So the new records show that Britain was indeed following the pan-Arab strategy, which in fact aimed to bolster the prestige and influence of Ibn Saud in pan-Arab politics. They hoped that his stature would be an obstacle to any German or Italian overture to the Arab movements, which might promise federation or independence during the war. There was no attempt to appease the Palestinians. In fact, only the Egyptian and Iraqi delegates tried to satisfy their interests. And when they failed, Britain and Saudi Arabia forged the white paper without any consideration for Palestinian interests. And anti-Semitism or Orientalism don't really stand out as features in this process. So British policy was guided throughout this process by GC and CS intelligence on the communications of the Saudi and other Arab delegations. And with a clear understanding of their bargaining positions, Britain got the most it could out of the white paper. The Jews in Palestine remained loyal, with few exceptions, and supported the war effort. The Saudis offered benevolent neutrality, and Pan-Arab Federation never threatened Britain's hold on the Middle East during the war. And in fact, Britain tried to ride the Pan-Arab Federation tiger beginning in the middle of the war. Ibn Saud got everything he wanted. He demanded limits to Jewish immigration and to prevent the Palestinians from becoming a minority in their country as a result of the Zionist policy. Ibn Saud told the Palestinians that it's up to them to carry out the rest of the policy once they rejected it. The Arabian Bismarck mastered realpolitik. He secured his interests and championed the Arab movements by delivering the first meaningful blow to Zionism. As one of his ministers said when arguing for closer relationships with Britain, Palestine is but a small section of the great Arab fatherland. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Steven, for this very engaging presentation that provided us with a lot of intellectual food for thought. So the floor is open for questions. I would just ask you to please state your name and affiliation, where you're from, so that Steve would also have an opportunity to know who you are.
Hi, I'm Amir. I'm doing my postdoctorate here in the McGill Institute. Thank you for a very penetrating lecture. My question is, you describe Ibn Saud as this staunch ally of Britain. He accepts British hegemony until at least he started to transfer his loyalties to the Americans during the war. Because he understands they are the empire on the rise. But in 1935, and you mentioned it, he makes a small deal with the Italians and sells them camels.
That's right.
For the Abyssinia invasion. I know that at that point the British didn't care that much that Mussolini would crush Abyssinia. They had their own problem, I think, with Haile Selassie regarding the Nile or something. Their interest in Egypt, I don't remember exactly. But didn't he hedge his bets also on the Italians? Because the Italians, until World War II, were seen as a credible threat to, to British control of the Middle East.
Yeah, so as a realist, he's always hedging, which is part of the reason why the Americans have concessions for oil exploration and not the British. The British are concerned about Ethiopia, and they don't want the Italians on the Red Sea. And until 35, it successfully kept them out for like 15 years. So, yeah, he is behaving as a realist, but the difference is they can read his communications with the Italians and his communications with his ministers, right? Because he's never like in a palace with them. He's always traveling around. So we have a really good idea of the entire policy process. This is only periodically that they'll meet in person, which means that we know that everything he and his ministers are telling the British is verifiable. Like he says, we're just selling them, we're independent, you are independent, the Italians are independent, we're going to do business with whoever we want, that's fine. And then they see all the nasty things he says about the Italians and how we should limit them and so on and so on. So the British aren't that fearful of his relationship with the Italians, and they know they're number one at this.
Thank you. Next.
I'm having
Just your name, please.
Sam. I'm having a little problem in the sense that the white paper was supposedly designed to manage the Palestinian Jewish problem. As you pointed out, because of Ibn Saud's influence, Britain decided it was in their best interest to work with the Saudis rather than the Palestinians. So that leaves the question still open. How do they expect to handle the Palestinian Jewish problem, since they were now favoring the Saudi position, which was different than the Palestinian one.
Right.
So that still leaves us a question of what do you do with the problem that was starting the whole mess?
Right. So the Saudi role in this process is not well understood in the public domain at this time. So high-level people, diplomats, know what true relationship is. But even most Palestinian leaders have no idea the extent to which the Saudis and the British are behaving like close allies. So the British see a very clear path to the end of their problems in Palestine. One is independence. Independence is happening in other parts of the empire. They have the Government of India Treaty in 1936 and growth of like self-government throughout the empire. And this is going to happen around the empire at one point or another. So better we stay and guide the Palestinians toward that end. So you crush the rebels. There's still 2 divisions fighting in Palestine and doing very well by 1939. You keep your opponents away for as long as you can, and you intern the ones that you have control over, which is what they do throughout the war. They sit in camps. And the people who are going to be loyal to you, you give them jobs in government. And the idea was to train the Palestinians and Jews, right? There's a proportion of Jews who would have civil service posts as well. But to train them in self-government and get them ready for at least nominal independence. Yeah.
Just to follow up, I still have a problem in the sense that if one considers the later events that happened, and the fact that neither the Palestinians nor the Jews were happy with the plan, it would appear that the intelligence sources didn't sort of use sufficient foresight, and supposedly that's the role of intelligence, to try to see what's coming.
Yes.
And you sort of indicated in the sense that they were really blindsided by Saudi Arabia, and rather than dealing with the issues at hand.
Well, the relations with the Saudis are very intentional throughout the process, so that they understand everything that's happening. And what you're getting at is kind of key to my previous research about the Jewish insurgency in Palestine. And that's the real wild card, is how self-sufficient is the Yishuv? Nobody knows. The Yishuv doesn't know. Right?
Right.
When Ben Gurion talks about a Jewish commonwealth during the war at the Biltmore conference, first of all, nobody knows exactly what he means, but any kind of step towards independence scares most of the Zionist movement. People do not think that the Yishuv is ready for that, when in fact they're far more capable than anyone realizes. So if the Jews don't know, how are the British supposed to know? Right? So we're not dealing with looking into a crystal ball.
Well, except that supposedly the British are a more established, organized force as opposed to a state that has not yet come into being. So we're talking about, experienced people with all kinds of connections versus, in a sense, possible dreamers. So it's they're not quite equated.
Well, what I'm saying here, and kind of my long-term argument about this, is that the relationship was thought of by both parties, by the British and the Zionists, as dependent. The Zionists need the British in power to kind of keep the issue safe, to allow it to grow, and that means that if the British say it's not going to grow anymore, that's the rule, unless you want to fight about it, which they do in the end. So this is what it comes down to, is who can predict when the Zionist movement will decide to turn their gun on the British after 2 decades or more of cooperation.
Right.
And that's something I've written about in the past, and I'm revisiting in my future work.
Oh, yes, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I wasn't aware to what extent the white paper was in response to the British relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I guess my question is to what extent is that relationship influenced, like this outcome on the white paper, influenced by the discovery of oil in 1938? And had the oil been discovered off the coast of Tel Aviv, would the white paper, the arrow, have been in the opposite direction? And the second thing is I would like to know is, and this is a very different question, is to when does this radio communications technology emerges in the First World War? But Saudi Arabia, according to the presentation, I'm completely unaware of this before, acquires it in the 1930s. Who supplies them with the radio, and what kind of radio does the British supply them with the radio that they're going to listen in on? I mean, that's my guess. What really happened?
So
I think that's fascinating.
I'll answer in reverse. On the radio sets themselves, they probably just bought them from private industry, like Marconi Company or whatever. I don't know which sets, although I have probably find out actually if it's
That's very
important.
interesting.
But the key in terms of British listening in is not the manufacturer of the set, it's the code that's being used. Because it's just radio telegraph, right? You're still sending beeps and whistles through the airwaves. So it's a matter of figuring out what they need.
Okay, I guess my thing is what got the king to use the technology, because clearly he's somewhat resistant to it at first. It's not like they acquire it immediately after the First World War.
So he wants a modern government and a modern army and a modern administration, but he's a Bedouin.
Yeah.
So he needs to be able to govern remotely. The Wahhabi ulama tell him that radio is forbidden, that it's going to bring in foreign dangerous ideas and that sort of thing. And he makes a deal with them saying, we'll have a public broadcasting service. I get to use my private radio. And we'll have a public broadcaster where you get to spread the good word to the population. And, and that's
You have to state who you are, so for the benefit of
and on the
The oil issue, yeah.
So the British have secure sources for oil. Obviously the war kind of endangers it a little bit. I'm not sure they're that panicked about having access to oil in Saudi Arabia, because the moment they lose the concession bid, then it's not really in their hands. It's American companies that are there.
Okay.
But had oil been in Tel Aviv, let's say, well, that means they can do what they want, can't they? And I'm not sure they really know what they want to do. It's more they're improvising and are doing what they have to do throughout.
Yes,
please.
My name is Cameron McKenzie. I have 2 questions. You pointed out earlier that the white paper was not going to cause a lot of pro-British sentiment in the Arab world. Why not? Because clearly the white paper was paper designed by Arabs.
Yeah, it's just it wasn't designed by the Palestinians, and it didn't meet any of their core demands about immediate independence and introducing an assembly and pardoning the Mufti and his entourage.
So does that mean the Arab countries don't really care about the Palestinians that much?
Does it surprise you?
Second question is, how much were British movement, so shall we say, influenced by their relationship with France?
How much was the which movement?
British, the way that they acted, or the way, any movements they made, were they influenced by their involvement with France?
So until the fall of France, they actually have very good relations. Like from the end of the First World War until 1940, they're usually portrayed as competitive or hostile, some kind of rivalry, and there's an element of that. But in general, like I've seen the military liaison papers, and there's a problem. One side usually tells the other to get their act together, and within weeks or months they're providing reports. It's not that bad a situation. It's much better than most people usually describe it. Yeah.
Okay, Ira Robinson. Are there any wireless intelligence intercepts that reflect any Zionist attempts to approach the Saudis at this point?
So this is an important question, and since I started working on Mikhail Kahanov's book, which I just found out about, I'm now going to head back to archives and double check on that. There's in these GC and CS papers, there's very few intercepts of Zionist communications. That comes from MI6's own special radio security service, and it's much harder to find those papers. So usually when they need to share it with somebody, that's when you can see one. But from 1940-41 until the end of the mandate, they're regularly decrypting Jewish agency and Haganah cables, or cables and wires. So what are their relationships with Saudi Arabia? This is something Mikhail Kahanov discusses in his book, like why there's not really any successful meeting between the two sides. The Zionists try, I don't think they get very far.
Malcolm Olson, Concordia alumni. Is there any information that would show that that they were using landline cables instead of wireless, and using circuitous routes through other cities, which you can go directly to?
So in the British Empire, there is no secure cable if you're trying to keep a secret, because they all go through London. Okay. Any transatlantic cable goes through London, since the British rerouted them all at the beginning of World War I. And by the way, if you look at undersea fiber optic cables today, you can learn a very similar story about who's reading global communications. But yeah, I mean, you just use what's convenient. You can use cable, many companies do. Sometimes it's preferable. So it just depends. Yeah. It's probably an administrative choice.
Any more questions? No? If there are no more questions, then Steve, on behalf of the Institute and everyone here today, I would like to thank you once again for accepting the invitation and giving a very engaging talk.
Thank you.